Today's lesson is just going to be part one of a series on neuroanatomy and then chapter three of brain facts. So today we will be going over the different cranial nerves, the and the spinal cord. So column sections, cranial nerves, as well as voluntary motor movement. And this is just going to be a basic introduction to voluntary motor movement, or otherwise known as somatic motor control. And we're going to be looking at the way we can find certain regions of the brain that are responsible for this somatic motor control. Okay, so before we go into that, let's go over some of the basic neuroanatomical planes. First, in this picture, it seems pretty complex, but as you will see later, it's actually quite useful and it is easy to understand after a while. So let's go over the different terms. Okay, rostral. Rostral is the front end, and it's similar to anterior. If you guys haven't already gone over that, anterior means the forward half of the body. So pretend there's like a horizontal plane cutting your body in forward, backwards. The anterior is everything on that side of the plane. Now, the caudal tail is sort of like the posterior, the back of this plane. Now, rostral and caudal aren't the same as anterior and posterior because rostral and caudal are dependent on different structures. So as we see here, in this forebrain, we have the rostral at the front, the forehead, and the caudal near this primary visual cortex. But over here, the rostral end, if you see my mouse, this would be rostral, and down here would be caudal. So this would be up and that would be down, not front and back. So think of rostral as the head end and caudal as the tail end of a certain neuroanatomical structure, or an anatomical structure in general. Now, dorsal versus ventral. Now, dorsal versus ventral is a bit more straightforward. It's just talking about above or below. But like rostral and caudal, there's going to be a similar terminology that isn't exactly the same, which is superior and inferior. Superior means above the half line, and inferior means below a horizontal half line that separates your body pretty much at the waist. So, but in this case, ventral is above an anatomical plane and dorsal is below an anatomical plane. It is not always going to be this horizontal plane as with superior and inferior. So like we see here, this is dorsal, that is ventral, because this is going to be the top part of this plane. This is going to be the bottom part of this plane. It's not going to be the top and bottom in this way, but it's like that. And now we see superior here, inferior here, top, bottom, anterior, front, posterior, back. So guys, we're going to be looking at first off, we're going to be looking at the inferior cortex navigation. This is just going to be necessary when we're looking at some of the cranial nerves. And I'm just giving you guys a fair warning. We're going to be looking at a few videos of actual brains alongside images of actual brains. So if you guys get freaked out about that stuff, sorry in advance. Okay, so today we're going to be needing to know two different surfaces of the brain, the orbital surface and the tentorial surface. Now, the these are very big words. They're very, like, pretty straightforward things. Now, the orbital surface is what we see on the front part of the brain. It's going to be this anterior part of the brain, and it's going to be the bottom of this front. So as we see where this GR is on the picture, this is going to be the orbital cortex down here. There are different regions of this orbital cortex, but overall, where we see this line here, that's going to be the orbital surface, whereas there's a cortical surface and it's at the bottom front. Now, the difference between the orbital and tentorial surface is while they are both on the bottom, the tentorial surface is separated by this line we see here. So as we see, there's this large structure, then it goes off and there's a line. There's this bottom part here I'm showing with my mouse, and then this top part here. Now, this line is also known as the lateral or sylvian fissure / sulcus. Fissures and sulcuses are just essentially cuts down into the brain where there isn't folding, but rather just an absence of brain matter. And sulci are usually not as deep. Fissures are deeper. So it just really depends on what you want to consider this as. But essentially, there's this lateral sulci, and everything on this side of it is going to be the tentorial surface, while everything on this upper side is going to be the orbital surface. So as a brief demonstration, we're not going to watch this entire video, but, oh, oops. We have this here. If we skip through, sorry, there's no audio, and it's going to be important. We see this bottom surface. Right now, if we look, she is pointing to the pons, and that's also an arterial structure there as well. And this is going to be the tentorial surface of the brain. Okay, so now we'll go into spinal sections. There are about three, you could say there are subregions, but there are three major spinal sections you guys need to know. First, there's the cervical, then there's the thoracic, and then on the bottom, there is the lumbar. Now think of lumbar as in legs, L for legs. And because of this, the lumbar spine, or the very bottom, is responsible for moving your legs and everything below your waist. The thoracic, think of that as your above the waist, but below the shoulders. So like your chest, your stomach, your smooth muscles of the abdomen, all of that stuff. And cervical, think of cervical as in neck. We're looking at neck and everything above except for the face. The face is going to be controlled by something we'll go into later. So there's the cervical region, there's the thoracic region, and there's the lumbar region. Now, before we go any further, it's important to note that although it might seem different from the spinal cord, there's something called the cauda equina. The cauda equina isn't an entirely different structure, but rather it's just a subregion of the spinal cord. Like we see with the lumbar versus thoracic versus cervical, they're all in the same major vertebrae system where we see this backbone. They're just different regions of this that have different functions. And the cauda equina is are the nerve tracts within the lumbar spine region. And the cauda equina, the lumbar spine, is responsible for sensation, motor activity below the waist, and it's also responsible for arousal and many of the other bladder and sexual reproduction processes we have, or primates have. Okay, now we'll look at a spinal cross section. Spinal cross section, just don't think of this as very complex. Think of this side where my mouse is as the back, this side is the front, and we're not looking at the bones, we're just looking at the spine. So you see this dark stuff in the center. This is the gray matter. I'm sure you guys have talked about it in the past, but I'll just quickly say what it is. Gray matter is the are the cell bodies of neurons rather than the axons. They're mainly the cell bodies and dendrites. So this gray matter is going to be receiving signals, afferent signals. Afferent signals are going towards the brain, so from sensory nerves into the spinal cord. And then this white matter is primarily composed of axons. And what we know about axons is they come from a place. So these axons are going from the brain to different regions and to different muscles so they can bring motor signals, and they innervate these muscles to induce motor function. So think of efferent away from the brain, afferent towards the brain. Afferent sensory, efferent motor. Okay, now we'll go into the cranial nerves. Now, before we go into the cranial nerves, does anyone have any questions about what we've gone into so far? I'm taking that as a no. So when I went to the Brain Bee competition last year, I actually didn't know about this beforehand, and I'm sad that I didn't. But there's a phrase we can use to describe the 12 cranial nerves. OOO, to touch and feel very green vegetables. Ah, does anyone want to say that out loud? It's fun. Ray, Willis, do you guys want to? Taking that as a no. Okay. Yeah, no worries. So these are the order of the cranial nerves from OOO, the first three, to touch and feel, very green vegetables, ah. The first letters of each of these things are the first letters of the cranial nerves, or what they're called. Now, the cranial nerves the reason why they're called cranial nerves is because they don't go to the spinal cord. They only go to the head. So most of these cranial nerves are going to be going directly from the brain to the face and structures within the face. Now, because of this, that's why the face is so vulnerable to infection. And like what we see with these brain-eating amoebas, if we breathe something in, and or something comes in contact with our face, they can go through these cranial nerves into our brain and directly access our brain and cause so many bad things. Okay, starting with the first cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 1 is also known as the olfactory nerve. And the olfactory nerve, as we see on this bottom photo, is within the nose. It projects down into the nose where we have our different olfactory cells that pick up on different scents, then nose hairs which pick up on vibrations, and they communicate this back to the major olfactory nerve on this olfactory epithelium, which is the cell of the upper roof. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that, but of the nose, and these go directly to the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is on the orbital surface of the brain, and it is responsible for scent. And what's really cool about the olfactory bulb, it's one of the oldest structures in the brain, but it's also one of the most hardy structures. So when we get infections and those infections affect the olfactory bulb, as we see here, the nerves are going directly to it, so there's going to be inflammation and stuff. A lot of nerves die, but because the olfactory bulb is so special, it has a process that many other regions of the brain don't have, which is neurogenesis. It creates new neurons, and from what you guys have learned, the majority of regions of the brain do not create new neurons. So that's a really cool fact about the olfactory bulb, and that's also why we can smell over 25,000 distinct smells, and we're also able to recognize all of those smells. Okay, optic nerve 2, or otherwise known as the optic nerve. Okay, so the optic nerve is in two different branches, each one going to a different eye, and within that optic nerve, there's separate separations, and I think you guys covered that in the lesson 2 about vision. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm guessing so. And as we see here, the optic nerves go through the optic chiasm and project signals we get on the retina back to different regions of the brain that are responsible for seeing. So the optic nerve is responsible for transmitting visual signals from the retina to visual regions of the brain. Okay, oculomotor, or otherwise known as the cranial nerve 3. Now, what's something that's actually, it's good to memorize this. The first, excluding the olfactory nose, the first three cranial nerves are responsible for things that have to do with the eyes. And this helped me a lot when I was trying to remember everything because there's just so much stuff and it gets difficult after a while. But the first three, other than olfactory, are going to be responsible for stuff in the eye. So the oculomotor innervates a certain group of muscles. As you can see here, there are so many different muscles in the eye. It's extremely complex, but essentially, these muscles are responsible for depression or moving your eye down, elevation, moving it up, medial rotation, so side to side, and inferior oblique motion, which means like if you roll your eyes, but you're looking down at the same time. So that's what the oculomotor is responsible for. You just have to remember it is responsible for moving the eye up, down, left, right, and along the bottom. Now, the oculomotor also projects to the oculomotor nucleus in the midbrain. As we see, a lot of these cranial nerves go into different regions of the midbrain, but in reality, these regions aren't responsible for creating the things we see, or the things we do. They just project to the thalamus, which then goes to these higher order structures that then control what we do. So in this case, it projects to the oculomotor nucleus, but then this oculomotor nucleus, it sort of processes these signals, but it converts it into something that's more recognizable, transmits it to the thalamus, and then that goes on to different regions where we then can control, almost like voluntarily control, eye movement. Okay, now cranial nerve 4. or otherwise in Latin IV, and it's also called the trochlear. Now, it's a bit deceptive because if you guys learned about hearing, the cochlea, but this is not associated with the cochlea. It's something different. It's a bit annoying, but it is what it is. So, like the oculomotor, the trochlear is also responsible for movement of the eye. So it's responsible for superior and inferior oblique motor activity. So rolling your eye when it's looking up and when it's looking down. It's also responsible for adduction and depression. Adduction is when you're moving towards the midline. So go if I am with my left eye, I'm going to look to the right. That's abduction. And if I have my right eye and I look to the left eye is using adduction to look at the left side or the middle of our body. So think of adduction as looking at your nose. Now, again, I'm just going to mention this again. Cranial nerves 2 through 4, and we'll go over number 6 in a moment, are all associated with vision. It's pretty important to know that. So, yeah, as we see here, there's a diagram of the nerve, where it projects to, etc. Okay, cranial nerve 5, otherwise known as the trigeminal nerve. This one is actually really important to know. So if I were to know one of them or one of the T's, please try to remember this one. The trigeminal nerve is responsible for so many different things in our face, and it's why we have so much complex sensory information that we can feel on our face. The sensation we feel in our lips, on our tongue, on our forehead, pretty much everywhere on our face is because we have the trigeminal nerve. Now, the trigeminal nerve actually branches off into 3 separate nerves because of how precise it wants to be and how much perception it wants to give us. And because of that, there's also going to be these branches, which then allow for even greater and more precise innervation of muscles and receptors within the face. So the first branch is the ophthalmic. Think of op as the eyes. So this region is essentially going to give you all the sensory information from above the eyes. Now, the maxillary branch is going to be responsible for the sensory perception of below the eyes, but above the upper jaw, or yeah, above the maxillary bone, which you guys will learn about in a different lesson once we go through all the chapters of brain facts. Now, the mandibular nerve is actually responsible for 2 major things. It's both responsible for sensory perception of the lower face and also 2/3 of the front half of the tongue. I don't know why it's specifically 2/3, but it seems to be a pattern that some of these nerves are responsible for 2/3 of something and not the other 1/3. And it's also responsible for motor activity. So the trigeminal overall is responsible for both sensory and motor activity of the face. And this motor activity in specific is of the jaw. So it allows us to eat and chew. Now, something that's unique to the trigeminal system is there are proprioceptive neurons. So proprioceptive means we're able to perceive where we are in space and time without looking at ourselves. And it has these proprioceptive neurons scattered throughout the face, and they signal to the trigeminal system, which then projects these signals to a specific region of the brain called the mesencephalic trigeminal nucleus. It's in the brainstem, and it then goes to a whole bunch of other different structures, and it essentially tells us, hey, where is your body, and what are you doing? So that's why when we choose something, we don't have to think about, oh, our jaw is going to be 3 centimeters to the left, and now we need to move it 1 centimeter to the right. Our brain automatically gives us a spatial perception and allows us to adjust to that without having to think about it at all. Okay, now this is a lot. I know cranial nerves, it's a lot of information, so we're going to separate the other half of, well, a few other cranial nerves into a different lesson. So today we'll only go up to cranial nerve 8, and then there are also going to be 4 more that we'll go into next week. So yeah, just as an FYI. Okay, cranial nerve 6, the abducens. Now, if we remember, adduction is when we move towards the midline, and abduction is when we move away from the midline. So get from this, just think about moving your eyes away from your nose. That's what the that's what the abducens is responsible for. It's responsible for abductive motion of the eye. So in your left eye, that's going to be meaning looking left, and in your right eye, that's going to be meaning looking right. So there you go. And the muscle is called the lateral rectus. You don't really need to know that. Just know that the abducens is responsible for abductive motion. Abducen, abductive. Pretty easy to remember. Okay. Now, cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve. The facial nerve also has a whole bunch of different branches, and we're going to talk about that in the next lesson because there's not enough time in this lesson to go over everything. Plus, I don't want to break your brains because of so much stuff you guys have to remember. But essentially, the facial nerve is responsible for motor movement of the like top two halves of the face, so not the jaw, but of parts of the tongue, parts of the mandibular section, and parts of the ophthalmic section. Like we saw back in the trigeminal nerve, there were these three main regions of the face. It's responsible for these upper two, not the mandibular, the maxillary. And then the trigeminal is responsible for this here in the jaw. Okay, it is also responsible for taste on, again, 2/3 of the anterior portion of the tongue. And I don't know why, like, I don't know why with the trigeminal nerve it only controls this, but I just know it's 2/3. Just remember 2/3, have it imprinted into your minds. And yeah, it's also responsible for lacrimation and salivation. Both of these are just producing liquids in their excretory functions. Lacrimation is when you cry, so it's responsible for the production of tears in the tear duct, and salivation is when you produce saliva, so it's responsible for that as well. Okay, the last cranial nerve we'll go over today, and it's one of the more complex ones. It's called the vestibulocochlear, and it's this long name because in reality it's two separate cranial nerves that just kind of converge into one, but we call it vestibulocochlear because it's in such a small and closed off area of the body that it doesn't make sense to have two separate ones. Okay, so there are two main branches, the cochlear and the vestibular branch. The cochlear, as we know with the cochlea, is responsible for hearing things. It projects auditory signals from the cochlear hair cells of the cochlea to the cochlear nuclei in the brainstem. Again, none of the primary structures that allow us to hear are in the brainstem and allow us to do a whole bunch of other things are in the brainstem, but these initial structures in the brainstem project all the way up to these major things like within the temporal lobe. That's what allows us to hear. So that's why our brainstem is so important to have. Without it, if something bad happened to it, even if we had normal function with our other regions of the brain, it pretty much screws up everything. Okay, so now we have the vestibular branch. The vestibular branch, this is slightly more conceptual, but it projects sensory information from the semicircular canals, like what we see over here, of the inner ear, and also the otoliths, which are like regions within these semicircular canals. And these two different things provide us with rotational information. So, like if we're moving our head around, if we're being moved around in circles. And then the otoliths are responsible for linear movement, so like back and forward, walking backwards, and gravity perception, which is very complex. I don't know how that works. Sorry, there's a notification on Zoom. Okay. Anyways, yeah. So that's the vestibular branch. Together, these vestibular branches and cochlear branches converge into one nerve at some point, even though in reality they're two separate nerves. Okay. So before we move on to voluntary somatic movement, do any of you guys have questions? I'll take that as a no. If you guys have questions while I'm speaking, just put them in chat and then I'll answer them. So voluntary somatic movement and voluntary and somatic mean the same thing. Somatic is the technical term for being able to be consciously controlled, and it is actually not as complex as you'd think if you're not doing complex things, but essentially there are a few different things you need to remember. Voluntary or somatic movement is primarily controlled by the primary motor cortex, otherwise known as the PMC. The second thing is that skeletal muscles are the only somatically controlled muscles that are controlled by the brain and that we can voluntarily control, while smooth muscles are involuntarily controlled by other regions of the brain. So like in the medulla where it's responsible for heartbeat and then digestion and movement of the intestinal muscles. Those are all smooth muscles, and those are stuff we don't think about. Imagine if we had to think about our hearts beating. That would really suck. Okay, so with skeletal muscles, we know that they're primarily on the skeleton, as we saw with the oculomotor and the what's it called, the trochlear nerves. Those were also skeletal muscles, and they weren't exactly on bones, but pretty much all skeletal muscles are going to be near the skeleton and near bone structures. So with this, they're also going to be dictating flexion and extension. Flexors or flexor skeletal muscles reduce the angle between joints, while extenders increase the angle between joints. Together, this allows us to keep things in place. So, like if we're trying to hold something up and hold it above our heads, flexors are agonized while extenders are agonized while flexors are antagonized, which allows us to hold stuff in place until we need to stop holding it in place. Now going into agonists versus antagonists, agonists are essentially signals that tell a muscle to contract, tells a flexor to flex or an extender to extend, whereas antagonists tell a skeletal muscle to relax. So these and antagonists are found in both skeletal muscles and some of the more involuntary things we do, even with skeletal muscles. So in the second lesson, we'll go into some of the reflexes, which are controlled by skeletal muscles, but not by the primary motor cortex. And it's actually quite cool. But these agonist and antagonist signals work in unison to allow us to do many complex things. So, the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is also known as the precentral gyrus. A gyrus just means a cortical surface of the brain that is not separated by major sulci. So, in this case, we have this here. This is going to be the primary motor cortex. Now, the primary motor cortex goes down in our brain and out around, and it's going to be in the frontal lobe, right before the parietal lobe. So it's weird, and this is the scariest image I've ever seen when looking at a neuroscience textbook. I still have nightmares of it. And there's the feet, legs, they're going to be inside, and it's going to go arm, hand, then it's going to be your face, tongue, and larynx. So there's not really a way to teach this. You just have to remember it. And it's not going to be hard to remember because of how frightening it is. Still gives me the heebie-jeebies. Okay, so finding the precentral gyrus via a central sulcus. As we saw earlier, there was a sulcus, which is this deep line, or not deep line, this superficial line. And the central sulcus just happens to be much deeper than most other sulci. Oop. Turn on captions. Sorry for no volume, guys. I can't control it. Speed this up. So what he's showing is a mid-sagittal view. He's just pointing out some of the major structures we see. Corpus callosum, cingulate gyrus. You guys don't really need to know about the cingulus gyrus yet. We'll teach that at a different time. But as you see, there's the sulcus along the cingulus gyrus that is called the cingulus sulcus. If you follow that along until you get to this part that there's a center that goes directly up, that is going to be the central sulcus. It's the marginal branch of the cingulate sulcus, and that's otherwise known as the actually, this is not the central sulcus, but it's indicating where the central sulcus is. If we go one line forward from this marginal branch, that's when we see this central sulcus right here. The central sulcus isn't as deep as this marginal branch, and it's a common misconception that this here is the central sulcus, and that's just a random thing, when in reality, you have to trace this along the cingulate sulcus that goes along the center, go up, and then go one left. So we go to this sort of shallow part. Everything to the left of this part is going to be the primary motor cortex, while everything to the right is going to be the primary somatosensory cortex, which I don't know if you guys covered yet, but it's just the place where we perceive touch and other things. And the primary motor cortex and the primary sensory cortex, since they're in the same gyral structure here, a few slides ago when we saw that like weird image that I told terrified you applies along this. So there's going to be the legs and all the other things for sensory stuff on this side and the same on the other side. It's just a reflection, but for different types of signaling. Now together, this is also known, these two regions are also known as the precentral and postcentral gyruses. Pre meaning it's before the central sulcus, and post meaning it's right after the central sulcus. And in some cases, you can trace this sulcus all the way down to the lateral fissure, which we talked about earlier. But if you're given a sagittal view of the brain cut in half from this other side, which he showed earlier, I would use the cingulate sulcus because the exterior cortical surface is not always easy to read, and there are a whole bunch of different folds. So I'll link this video. We don't need to watch the full thing, plus we're running out of time. Okay, so next week we're going to be going over cranial nerves 9 all the way to 12. Then we're going to go into the fine neuroanatomy of neurons and motor activity. So we're going to be going into the different types of neurons that allow us to have motor control. And we're also going to be going into how they signal with each other, all that fancy schmancy stuff. We're also going to be going into involuntary or autonomous motor activity, and I don't know why it isn't written here, but if we have time, we're also going to go into diseases of the motor system and motor neurons. So for today, here's some recommended resources. If you guys want to take a screenshot, we'll also send these slides out after the meeting. Read Chapter 3 of Brain Facts. Read Chapter 7 of Neuroscience, 7th edition. You can just find this online as a PDF. You can also read Unit 6, Motor Systems of Neuroscience, 7th edition. And then there's also a crash course on YouTube that has not only stuff about motor control in the cranial nerves, but general neuroscience and general neuroanatomy, and it's pretty useful. Okay, so that's all for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask, and feel free to email as well. I'll try to respond to anything. If not, then I guess we'll close out this meeting today, and I'll send a recording out via email. All right, have a good one, guys.